our, so I'm handing over, it's my privilege to hand over this to our fantastic speakers. But before that, our moderators who are very experienced pediatric neurologists, Dr. Arijit Chattopadhyaya, a pediatric neurologist from Kolkata, who has trained in India as well as in UK. He was trained in Redmond Street Hospital, where he completed his CCST, finished his FRCPCH, following his DCH and MD pediatric training and MRCP. So currently, Dr. Arijit works in Apollo Gleneagles in Kolkata and in ICH in Kolkata, and has several publications and editorships and awards to his credit. So thank you, Dr. Arijit, for agreeing to chair this session, to moderate the session, and welcome to Dr. Neelu Desai, who is a pediatric neurologist based in Hinduja Hospital in Mumbai, and has over 15 years in pediatric neurology and in epilepsy, with a special interest in complex epilepsy and neuroimmunology. She too was trained in Great Ormond Street and in BJ Wadia Hospital in Mumbai. Again, she is also the author of a lot of publications, more than 20 in peer-reviewed journals, and has been the awardee of Bill Marshall Fellowship in ICH. So on to both of you. Thank you for helping us with this session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. So we'll start this very interesting session, which is cerebral palsy mimics, and we've got three wonderful speakers. And I'd like to congratulate Dr. Anne for her wonderful work. The first speaker will be introduced by my co-chairperson.
Welcome everyone for this 15th and last session of this series, and the first in this series of talk on cerebral palsy mimics is going to be, this first speaker is Dr. Renu Sutar, who is going to speak on hereditary spastic paraparesis. She is a associate professor on pediatric neurology in the Department of Pediatrics, PGI Chandigarh. She has done her MD pediatrics as well as DM pediatric neurology from the same institute. She has more than 110 publications and book chapters, and her special areas of interest are in CNS infection, pediatric stroke, and neuromuscular disorders. She is a principal investigator in a lot of clinical trials, and also has received RCPCH visiting fellowship and AOCCN travel fellowships in 2017 and 19. So over to you, Dr. Renu Sutar, for the first talk.
Thank you, ma'am, for kind introduction. So I'll share my slides first. Okay. So my slides are visible?
Yes.
Okay. So I thank Dr. Anne ORDI for this a wonderful webinar session. It has been a huge success. And I too personally attended several of these webinars and find it really very, very interesting, and they are up to date to the topics. So to begin with, so I'll be dealing with the hereditary spastic paraparesis, a common mimicker of childhood cerebral palsy, as well as inborn error of metabolism. So it's a large group of disorders with the various clinical phenotypes, as well as with several of the genes. So very heterogeneous group of disorders. Classically, they have progressive spasticity of the lower limbs, and it was first described in 1880 with the also called as Strumpel-Lawrence syndrome, where Dr. Strumpel has described a family of 3 people, where the father as well as 2 brothers has a walking difficulty and called them as a little lame. And the primary pathology in hereditary spastic paraparesis is axonal degeneration in the spinal cord. Though it is a rare disease, but the incidence varies across the globe. So it's very common in Spain as compared to the rest of the countries. Usually symptoms are slowly progressive in hereditary spastic paraparesis. So several of the classification schemes has been used for classification of HSP. The common ones are like the pattern of inheritance, like autosomal dominantly inherited, recessively inherited, and X-linked disorders. And previously, the classification of pure and complex HSP was also used. Pure, where there is a dominant symptoms, are spastic paraparesis, and complex, where in addition you have pyramidal as well as external manifestation. Previously, type 1 and type 2 classification was also used, where type 1 was usually younger onset but slowly progressive. However, type 2 were onset after 35 years of age with rapidly progressing course. However, these classifications are usually not stood the test of the time. Now it is more classified according to the inheritance pattern as the gene in which gene sequences in which they are discovered. So diagnostic criteria for pure HSP suggests that there should be family history positive. The symptom should be progressive in terms of gait disturbances. There should be spasticity, hyperreflexia, as well as extensor plantar response. So other common features are like sensory disturbances in the dorsal column. You have sensory and joint position impairment, pes cavus, bladder disturbances, weakness in the lower limb with hyperreflexia. There may be some dysmetria and there may be absent ankle reflexes at time. However, complete weakness is absolutely odd for the diagnosis of HSP, and absolutely thinning or amyotrophy is also odd for the diagnosis of HSP. So if you think that paralysis is much more than spasticity, like weakness is much more than spasticity, prominent ataxia, atrophy, if there is a marked upper limb or bulbar involvement, neuropathy, retinal pigmentation changes, extrapyramidal signs. So usually these are alert for the diagnosis of pure form of HSP, and then you need to think about more complex HSPs or some HSP mimics. So sorry, the slides got disturbed. So the clinical features are predominant in the lower limbs, and upper limb you can find subtle hyperreflexia or tone changes, but the weakness, spasticity is typically located towards the lower limb. So sometimes there may be minimal distal wasting. Typically they have a circumduction gait with toe walking, and some weakness of the anti-gravity muscles is seen, like iliopsoas, tibialis anterior, and hamstrings. And usually the spasticity is much more in comparison to the weakness in these patients. So manual muscle testing usually shows near normal power. However, this is because the spasticity is the problematic one rather than the weakness in these patients. And usually the course is static or slowly progressive. So this is a video of a typical patient of spastic paraparesis, where you can see there is a bilateral circumduction, tiptoe walking. And because of imbalance, the patient is usually try to run or to compensate for the weakness in these patients. So in children, spastic paraparesis is predominantly caused by the most common phenotype is secondary to the cerebral palsy, in which children with the premature babies or who had HI, they usually present with spastic paraparesis. And other common conditions are inherited metabolic disorders, which presents with spastic paraparesis. And the third group is familial spastic paraparesis. So clinically, all the three conditions present with overlapping features, like they have delayed walking, achievement of delayed walking, there will be toe walking, scissoring, lower limb dominant spasticity, contractures, reflexes, there may be developmental delay, microcephaly. And in spastic CP, you have variable spectrum from paraplegia, diplegia to quadriplegia. However, in IMs, in addition to spasticity, you may have episodes of encephalopathy, movement disorder, bradykinesia, Parkinsonian features, in addition to developmental delay and microcephaly. And usually some episodic nature is there of these worsening in symptoms. And HSPs are usually limited to the lower limb, where there is a significant tone changes and contractures. Complicated phenotype may show additional neurological signs of ataxia, peripheral neuropathy, basal ganglia involvement, epilepsy. However, classically upper limb and bulbar involvement is rare in these patients. Course is usually slow and steadily progressive in these patients. So in children who present with the spastic cerebral palsy phenotype, when you should think about an HSP or HSP mimic. So in the absence of a well-defined history or a clear-cut history of prematurity or perinatal or postnatal brain injury. And in HSP or IMs, usually the symptom onset occurs after a period of normal development. So initial the developmental milestones in terms of motor milestones are achieved normally in these patients, like up to 1 to 2 years. And then after they show clear-cut regression of milestones, rarely they can have a initial motor delay and subsequent regression, but clear-cut there will be a period of normal development should be achieved in these patients. And if you have new or accumulating neurological signs and symptoms, like in addition to spasticity, progressive symptoms of involvement of vision, atrophy, retinopathy, or if you involving symptoms of ataxia, weakness, then we should think about a progressive pathology like HSP. A family history would definitely support also autosomal dominant kind of spastic paraparesis, and parental consanguinity can support autosomal recessive kind of PSP. And if you think that the course is little atypical, MR brain is normal or inconsistent with the postnatal or perinatal insult, then definitely we should think about a possible inborn error of metabolism or spastic paraparesis. So first I'll talk about IMs, which are common mimics of HSP because of these are usually treatable disorders. Why IMs are very common as presentation of HSP? Because these motor neurons in the spinal cord and the cortex has long corticospinal tracts with their long axons, and they have very high energy demand, and usually they are vulnerable to metabolic disorders. Though they are rare and under-recognized, but as a whole group, they forms a very large group of treatable disorders. And their phenotype is usually more common as a complicated HSP phenotype rather than a pure HSP phenotype. And sometimes they are diagnosed as CP and remain undiagnosed. So this table from a like an article recently published shows some treatable IMs which can present as spastic paraparesis. Some of these are arginase deficiency, urea cycle disorder, biotinidase deficiency, dopa responsive dystonia, triple H syndrome, and adrenoleukodystrophy. So this table is conditions which we have seen as a treatable cause of IMs which are presenting as HSP phenotype in this North Indian part. So we have seen that combined methylmalonic acidemia and homocystinuria, combined CBCL defects, MTFHR mutations, and classic homocystinuria, vitamin B12 deficiency. So combined MMA and CBCL defects are usually a very important and treatable cause of HSP in our spastic paraparesis in this part of country. In addition, biotinidase deficiency, adrenoleukodystrophy, adrenomyeloneuropathies, cerebral folate deficiency, urea cycle disorder, especially arginase and triple H syndrome. And among HSP, complicated HSP phenotype with bradykinesia or movement disorder, dopa responsive dystonia, and ADCY5 are among the other treatable conditions. And GLUT1 can mimic like any of the neurological disorders. So these are the conditions which we commonly see as a cause of complicated, possibly complicated HSP phenotype. So these are the differential diagnosis of HSP in pediatric among leukodystrophy, ALD, metachromatic leukodystrophy, Krabbe, mitochondrial, LBSL, vanishing white matter disease. Among acquired white matter disorders, MMA, biotinidase deficiency, demyelinating illnesses can cause spastic paraparesis later on. In presence of optic atrophy, biotinidase deficiency, cobalamin C, cerebral folate deficiency, these are the important causes. Retinopathy, again common in CBLC, Sjogren-Larsen syndrome, and cerebrotendinous xanthomatosis. Episodic worsening we have seen, we can see in children with the homocystinemia, arginase deficiency, MMA, urea cycle disorders, and homocystinuria. So these are the broad group of differential diagnosis of spastic paraparesis phenotype. So I'll go through some of the cases which mimicked spastic paraparesis, and then some of the cases where we could diagnose a pure form of spastic paraparesis. So the first case is a 13-year-old girl. She was second born out of a non-consanguineous family, and she remained normal till 7 years of age, and subsequently she has regression of motor milestone. So she developed spasticity, exaggerated reflexes, she developed contractures, and in addition, she had tremors as well as gait ataxia. On an examination, she has spasticity, wrist reflexes, and she has loss of vibration and joint position, and subsequently by 9 to 10 years of age, she also developed bladder symptom. So this was a recent video in an OPD visit where we can see she has scissoring TA contractures, lots of adductor spasticity, crisscross gait with TA contractures. Though her upper limb, her cognition is, according to parents, is good. She is attending online classes. So to her surprise, initial MRI at the 7-year, at the 9-year remained absolutely okay. And by 11 to 13 years, she developed this kind of florid white matter changes, which were involving the periventricular white matter changes. involving the carpus callosum, posterior limb of internal capsule, and then anterior predominant, some anterior involvement. More dominantly, it was located toward the periventricular white matter and posteriorly. So investigation showed normal metabolic profile, vitamin E, TMS, biotinidase. We investigated for leukodystrophies also. For common leukodystrophy, workup was negative. Initial exome sequencing reported and some VUS, which was not correlating with her symptoms. And subsequently, then we did a whole exome sequencing in this child, and we got a paroxysomal disorder that was PEX13 gene, and it was a compound heterozygous. So this was possibly this was a girl with the PBD and little rarer phenotype. Another case is a boy who again presented with spastic paraparesis with urinary complaints. Examination showed normal higher mental functions, some wasting in the thighs with spasticity, little bradykinesia. Sensory examinations were normal, and he had bladder symptoms. So MR brain showed posterior limb of internal capsule changes, and marked spinal cord changes was noted in the form of T2 hyperintensity involving the central part of the cord in the cervical, as well as it was a longitudinal extensive myelitis in this patient. So workup for the acquired causes like NMO, MOG, these were all negative, and VLCF was elevated, and the child was diagnosed as adrenoleukodystrophy, but his presentation was more like an adrenomyeloneuropathy presentation. So there is another case. There's a 6-year-old boy who was normal till 4.5 years of age with behavioral changes and walking difficulty, some impairment in a higher mental function with asymmetric spastic paraparesis, more on the left side as compared to the right, with impaired joint position and vibration with normal bladder and bowel. So this was his gait, where he shows subtle asymmetric paraparetic weakness with the more circumduction towards left side. So a diagnosis of childhood onset progressive asymmetric paraparesis with cognitive changes as well as dorsal column involvement was clinically there. So this was his MRI, which showed extensive white matter changes starting from the periventricular white matter involving carpus callosum, anterior, posterior, plaque, posterior limb internal capsule, and then it went down towards the tracts. Anterior part of the tracts were involved completely in the medulla, pyramids, as well as anterior part of the cord, as well as dorsal columns were involved. So whole of the spinal cord shows white matter changes. So diagnosis of LBSL was considered. MR spectro shows elevated lactate peak. So with these two differential diagnoses, this patient is being followed up. So again, it's a mimic of PSP in children and autosomal recessive disease secondary to DAS2 mutation. Another treatable cause we have seen is MMA with CHC in this part of the region very commonly, whereas a 5-year-old girl presents with walking difficulty, then progressive sleepiness. She admitted with acute encephalopathy in our ward with microcephaly, hypertonia, spasticity, bradykinesia, bradypnea. Slowly she recovers, and subsequently during recovery, she although her cognitions was back to the normal, but she has severe spastic paraparesis with lots of walking difficulty. So investigation, the initial clue was elevated MCV in this child, which was approximately 120, and mild hyperammonemia. Homocysteine was markedly elevated, 182 with low methionine, high urinary homocysteine excretion, and GCMS showed markedly elevated MMA. B12 levels were normal. MR was showing mild atrophy and white matter changes, with EG showing diffuse cortical atrophy. So with this biochemical profile, a combined hyperhomocysteinemia with the methylmalonic acidemia was considered, and she was subsequently diagnosed to have CBL-C defect. So this is an important another cause of treatable spastic paraparesis in our cohort. And there is another case which is like non-treatable, but definitely a mimic of spastic paraparesis. A 3-year-old girl with the normal attainment of walking ability by 1 year, but by 1.5 years she developed the difficulty. Short stature with the dysmorphism, larger upper segment in comparison to the lower segment, with kyphoscoliosis, spastic paraparesis, extensive plantar, and hepatomegaly. So this was a published case from our unit where there is lordosis, short stature, And she has all the features of dysostosis multiplex with the abnormal sella J shape, with rib abnormalities, changes in the acetabular area in the hip. There was vertebral changes, there was anterior beaking. So a diagnosis of MPS was considered, and she was found to have MPS type 4 Morqueuse syndrome. So these are some of the treatable or IMs or metabolic diseases which presents with HSP phenotype. So again, I want to remind this table that these are the treatable conditions which can present as HSP and should be considered as a differential diagnosis in all children who had acquired or initial maybe normal period, and then subsequently they develop progressive spastic paraparesis. Now coming toward HSP, this is a case of HSP where is a 5-year-old female presented to us from 2.5 years of age, history of recurrent falls and walking difficulty with the normal perinatal period with delayed motor milestones and language milestones. There was no additional symptoms of seizures, fluctuation in symptoms, or bladder or bowel disturbances. She has anemia, equinus deformity, spasticity, brisk reflexes, and reduced vibration perception with extensor plantar and scissoring gait. The father was also examined, and he had a history of great problems from childhood and required surgical correction at TA. And he showed a spasticity with paraparesis and contractures at ankle and hip. So diagnosis of an autosomal dominant inherited hereditary spastic paraparesis versus IM was considered. So this is the video of the child, again showing cognitively okay with the spasticity as well as toe walking. So this was her MRI with essentially normal and even weighted images. Subtle changes in the posterior limb of internal capsule or suggestive of little dysmyelination. Otherwise, periventricular white matter and tracts was normal, and spinal cord was also looking little thinner in this part of the images. So again, her workup, most of the essentially inborn error of metabolism screening with TMS, GCMS, ammonia were normal, and she was, along with genetics, she was diagnosed as a missense variation in ALT1 gene, which was heterozygous, and it was a pathogenic variant with SPG type 3A. So this was a case of HSP type 3A, which was autosomally dominantly inherited disorder. So now coming to HSP, as I've told you, these are rare, but these are progressive and heterogeneous group of disorders with the pure and complex phenotype. So pure, when we say that it is only associated with spastic paraparesis, and there may be mild sensory changes in the form of dorsal column dysfunction and bladder dysfunction. So the pure forms of HSP are usually autosomally dominantly inherited in 80% of the time. And the complex HSP, when we say then when there is a extra neurological or neurological symptoms are present along with the spastic paraparesis, and most of common of these are like GDD or later intellectual disability. There may be epilepsy, dystonia, bradykinesia, ataxia, peripheral neuropathy, optic atrophy, retinopathy, deafness, ichthyosis, and usually these complex HSP are inherited as autosomally recessively. So almost every year there are more genes has been described. So in a paper was published in 2010, say 25 genes were known, and this 21 published in 21 says 85 gene causing loci and 70 known genes are associated with HSP. So they are labeled as spastic gait genes according to the number of identification and inherited as dominantly, recessively, and X-linked. Rarely mitochondrial also, and most common HSP is autosomal dominant is SPG type 4. So this is a little complex table, but I just want to say these are pure forms of HSP which are autosomally dominantly inherited and has a childhood onset. So the most common one are SPG type 4 and SPG type 3. Type 3A is caused by ALT1 gene, atlastin gene, and is inherited at autosomal dominantly form. And usually onset is in less than 10 years of age, and it is the most frequent cause of dominant and sporadic HSP, which is less than 10 years of age onset. Type 4 is caused by spastic gene mutation, and it has a pure HSP phenotype, dominantly inherited with variable age of onset from infancy to childhood. So usually the mean age of these children present at around 7 years of age, but onset can occur in first 2 to 3 years of life also, like in in this series, the varied from the infancy to the up to 10 adolescent. And this is the second candidate gene in autosomally dominantly suspected HSP, which has onset less than 10 years of age. Other for SPG 6, 10, 12, and 31. So these are pure forms of HSP which can have childhood onset presentation. So typically early childhood onset are SPG 3A, 4A, and 31 has onset at like mean age in this 5 patient with SPG 31 was around 4 years of age. So these are the few important causes of dominantly inherited pure HSPs which has early infantile onset. So this is another complex table in which we can see these are autosomally recessively inherited, and usually these are complex phenotypes. So they can present with the posterior dorsal column dysfunction, cerebellar ataxia, ophthalmoplegia-like symptoms, peripheral neuropathy, retinopathy, intellectual disability, psychiatric symptoms, bulbar symptoms, extrapyramidal movement disorders, and developmental delay. So complicated and recessive one are difficult to diagnose and has more mimickers. So in this phenotype, definitely an IM should be suspected. So coming towards the diagnostic clue for HSP, in addition to the clinical findings of positive family history, so a parental examination is must when we are suspecting HSP in any patient. So examine the parents, see the reflexes, see their gait and how they are walking. So this is we have to do in each and every patient where we suspect HSP. So MRI usually can be a normal, or they may show a thin corpus callosum, or there may be non-specific white matter changes. Mild cerebellar atrophy can be there. Spine may show a thin thoracic and cervical cord. Sometimes nucleus cuneatus and gracile atrophy can lead to enlargement of the central gland, so can be reported as hydromyelia. These are some specific spastic paraparesis gene associated with MR changes, like SPG1 is X-linked and associated with hydrocephalus and aqueductal stenosis. SPG2 is allelic to Palacios Marsh-Becker disease, so there may be some white matter hyperintensities. SPG7 and 11 may show basal ganglia involvement in addition to the clinical features of dystonia and Parkinsonism. And there will be marked cerebellar atrophy in SPG7. In these patients, Mercado-Joseph is usually a close differential diagnosis. So these are some of the examples of radiology of these patients. So this is a normal patient at this image is taken from a journal. A 20-year-old normal patient with HSP, where 15-year-old patient with normal patient and 15-year-old patient with HSP. You can see there is a thinning of corpus callosum predominantly in the anterior part, and there is a thinning of the spinal cord. Cerebellum also appears mildly reduced, and this diameter of the spinal cord in AP direction is reduced. So thinning of the spinal cord, corpus callosum, these are the most common radiological finding. Again, similar thinning of the corpus callosum. There is another well-defined sign in HSP 11 and 15, that is ear of link sign. So if you can imagine here, along the frontal horn, forceps of the frontal horn, you have a little hypointensity in this area, which is bright in flare and T2 weighted changes, and you can imagine a little hair-like projection here. And sagittal may show a thin corpus callosum. So this sign is taken from this appearance of the ear of you can see here that this is similar to T1 weighted images, where you see hypointensity with little hair-like projection, and in T2 you show T2 and flare you show bright with hair-like projection, and very specific to SPG 11 and 15. So again, in Zoom, you can see that same kind of hypointensity in T1 with the little hair-like projection. This is a normal, and this is SPG 11. This is normal, and this is SPG 11. So this is an ear of link sign in children and adults with SPG 11 and SPG 7. So these are the other radiological findings which can be seen in patient with SPG. So this is HSP 11 with again ear of link sign with subtle white matter changes. This is the thinning of the posterior part of the corpus callosum, cerebellar atrophy, white matter changes located to the posterior part of the occipital horn with the prominent cerebellar folia, sometimes limited to only to the splenium, and some changes in the cerebellum. And again, thinning of the corpus callosum, thinning, little dilatation of occipital horn, and periventricular white matter changes. So a wide range of MR images can be seen, but if the images doesn't fit classically with the cerebral palsy, or you don't have clear-cut risk factor, then if you see this kind of subtle white matter changes, then the diagnosis of HSP is not ruled out. So you have to consider that differential diagnosis. So this table shows so one cannot memorize, but you have to go through these tables. So year of link sign SPG 11 and 15, hydrocephalus SPG type 1, rarely 4, white matter hyperintensities 2, 11, 5, and 35, globus pallidus hypointensity 28, 35, and 43, thin thoracic spinal cord SPG 56, and thin corpus callosum can be seen in several of these HSPs. So some of the typical HSP examples, so HSP spastic paraplegia type 1, this is also known as Massa syndrome, that is mental retardation, aphasia, shuffling gait, and adducted thumb, and it is allelic to the X-linked aqueductal stenosis and hydrocephalus. So in presence of hydrocephalus, a boy, then this has to be thought of. Sometimes SPG4 also can show hydrocephalus. So another common type is SPG5, usually adolescent age, slowly progression, and wheelchair confinement by 35 years. Typical symptoms of gait difficulty, dorsal column dysfunction, sensory ataxia, bladder dysfunction. MR may show periventricular white matter changes, spinal cord atrophy, and mild cerebral atrophy. The diagnosis is confirmed by genetic sequencing for CYP7B1 gene. Another common is SPG7, that is complicated HSP phenotype, onset 20 to 30 years, spasticity. It has more complex phenotype, dystonia, Parkinsonism, eye, ocular involvement, external ophthalmoplegia. MR may show cerebellar atrophy and periventricular white matter changes. So though mean age is 20 to 30, but SPG7 is described as a pediatric cases. So gene is SPG7, and the pathogenesis is related to mitochondrial dysfunction. Another common form is SPG11, that causes thin corpus callosum and HSP. These genes also cause allelic phenotype, and usually it is late childhood and adolescent onset. And it is a complex phenotype with the developmental delay, learning issues, and usually it progresses to non-ambulation and wheelchair dependency. Additional symptoms include ataxia, scoliosis, neuropathy, cataract, hearing loss. So this is a proposed algorithm for diagnosis of HSP in children. So in children with the suspected HSP, if you think infectious metabolic causes has been ruled out, then according to inheritance pattern, if it is X-linked hydrocephalus, it is SPG1. And if it is you have multifocal X-linked multifocal white matter changes, SPG2. So X-linked disorders are SPG1 and 2. Autosomal dominantly inherited are SPG4, 6, and 8. And if spinal cord atrophy, 4, 6, and 8. Thin corpus callosum, 4 and 7. Cerebellar atrophy, think of SCAs and SPG7 also. In autosomally recessively inherited, if you have typical year of link sign 11 and 15, thin corpus callosum can be seen in several of these SPGs, and white matter abnormality can be seen in 5, 21, 35. So this algorithm can be referred when you deal with the case of HSP who is pending for genetic investigation to identify the closest gene. So I end my presentation here with the take-home messages that HSP in children has, overall, it has a very variable clinical spectrum with onset variable from infantile childhood to adult and adolescence. But our job is to think a treatable cause and think of HSP in patient who has spastic presentation but do not have clear-cut history of perinatal risk factor. Always think of a treatable cause of spastic paraparesis first. MMA, CHC, CBLC, biotinidase deficiency, urea cycle, GLUT, DYT, these are the treatable causes. And examine the parents in your OPD. So always expose them in the lower limb, see their reflexes, see their gaits. Usually if you miss that, then it is kind of missing the diagnosis in these patients, and diagnosis usually require confirmation with the genetic testing. Management is usually supportive in these cases, but if you get a treatable cause, definitely it is worthwhile to treat that cause of good outcomes in these patients. So thank you, ORDI. Thank you, AOCN, for this wonderful webinar series. And I acknowledge contribution of my team, Dr. Anveen Sankhya and Dr. Arushi Gallo at PGI. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Renu, for a very, very comprehensive, enriching talk with very good take-home messages, very good learning points. Dr. Arijit, thank you very much. I think we'll take the question. I can see a few questions, but we'll take the questions towards the end of the session. I think Dr.
Yeah, are we supposed to have the, I think Anaita is going to talk. Yeah.
Dr. Anaita will just say a few words.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, ORDI, on behalf of AOCN, from the entire team. We would like to thank the entire team of the ORDI, particularly Prasanna, for conducting this amazing neurogenetic series. A special big thanks to Anne. I think all of you have seen her diligently there, every session, every day, every message coming out to you. Thank you, Anne, for an excellent program, well-chosen topics, great speakers. I'd like to obviously thank all the moderators of all the sessions and all the speakers who took part in this program. I think this was an excellent webinar spread over maybe a little longer than expected, but I was actually thinking that we should consider doing this on an annual basis. So cheers to everyone, thanks, and we look forward to the last two talks for today.
Thank you, Anaita. So we'll move on to the next speaker, who is Dr. Siddharth Shah, a pediatric neurologist from Ahmedabad and part of the RICN. He's UK trained. His interests are in stroke, neurogenetics, and neuromuscular disease. He has got several publications, has been a keen academician, and has taken part in conferences and other activities, and also is one of the key persons who has been a part of the BPNA PET that was launched in India several years ago. So over to Siddharth for his deliberation on genetics of pediatric stroke.
Thank you very much, Arijit, for your kind words and the kind introduction. I would like to thank AOCN and ORDI for giving me this opportunity to speak in front of this learned audience. As Dr. Anaita Hegde has said, it's been a fantastic 15 weeks of knowledge sharing and collaboration between us all working in India. I'm very grateful that I have been given this topic, which I've been interested in for a number of years now. And what amazes me is that with the ease of diagnosis in using genetic tests, the field of neurology has moved quite fast forward. Especially this little niche field of pediatric stroke has also moved in the same pace. And today I will hopefully be able to tell you about a few conditions involved. So to start with, basically, as we divide stroke into ischemic, hemorrhagic, and cerebral synovenous thrombosis, we could straight away see how genetics is involved in stroke, in pediatric stroke. So if we look at the first column with ischemic stroke here, there are a number of polymorphisms we can talk about and whether they contribute to ischemic stroke. There are a number of now very well recognized monogenic disorders. I've given an example of collagen 4A1 and A2, which I'm going to talk about. There are a number of systemic disorders which are genetic in origin. So there's sickle cell disease, there's Fabry disease, and there is and a number of patients with these conditions will have cerebrovascular disease and stroke. There are conditions which are suspected to be genetic. They feel that they must have a genetic origin. One of the most interesting one is mineralizing angiopathy, which we all look out for in India and Southeast Asia, and now has been described from the West as well. But still, we have not been able to find a genetic origin for it. There is moya disease, and there have been interesting advances in recognizing the genetic basis of it, and I'm going to talk about that today. What I'm not going to touch upon is adult onset monogenic disorders. Again, there is a host of these disorders. There's CADASIL, there's CARASIL, and we usually don't see them in the pediatric age group. Looking at hemorrhagic stroke, there are again polymorphisms. Apolipoprotein E is one of the most common and studied polymorphism that can contribute to ischemic, to hemorrhagic stroke. Again, there's an overlap. So C677T and in the MTHFR gene can lead to ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke both. Intracranial aneurysms. So there's a host of genetic disorders, NF1, Marfan's, vascular form of Ehlers-Danlos, and these are all examples of genetic disorders that can lead to hemorrhagic stroke. Moya disease again. So in pediatrics, we deal with ischemic stroke more with moya, but as age advances, hemorrhagic stroke tends to be seen in moya disease. And again, sickle cell disease is an example of an overlap where you get ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke both. If we move on to cerebral synovenous thrombosis, factor V Leiden is one of the contributing factors, and so is homocystinuria, again with a genetic basis to it. So why do stroke disorders have a genetic origin? And straight away with this example or with this lovely diagram, it's very easy to understand why genetics and stroke are so interwoven. So if you look at the cross section of a blood vessel, you have the lumen, you have the intima, you have the media, and you have the adventitia. Of course, there is supporting elastin fibers. So there's the internal elastic lamina and there's the external elastic lamina. And straight away, you can see that there are a number of genes that come into play, and they have a basis in angiogenesis. And of course, a lot more to do with the microenvironment and the development of the blood vessels over lifetime. But it's not just the structure of the blood vessel. Of course, you can see here, there could be abnormal metabolites. So homocystinuria and Fabry's disease are an example of abnormal metabolism that can lead to stroke with a genetic basis. And of course, you know, here in the corner at the bottom, there is a mention of Notch signaling pathway and TGF-beta pathway. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit in one of my slides. So what are the clues to a diagnosis of genetic stroke? When should you suspect a diagnosis of genetic stroke? So if you have a child who has typical clinical and radiological features presenting with arterial ischemic stroke that you know fit with one of the known monogenic disorders that we're going to talk about today, then you could straight away think of a genetic stroke in the absence of other risk factors or other causes. Always when you think of genetic stroke, think of both occlusive and aneurysmal disease. A number of these conditions will have both. So you have occlusion and you have aneurysmal disease. And often you have ischemia and hemorrhage both overlapping. So if you see this happening in different vascular territories, then it is possible that you think you're dealing with a genetic stroke. Always take a family history, but not only of stroke, but involvement of diverse vascular beds. And I'm going to show a few examples of this. Especially the eyes are a great place to look for involvement of other vascular bed, and so is the kidney. When you're examining the child, look at findings of the skin, eyes, heart and great vessels, kidneys and other viscera, which might give you an example of involvement of multiple vascular beds, which might be a clue to a diagnosis of genetic stroke. So if you look at the classification of etiologies of stroke, then where does genetic stroke again fit in this? Basically, you have got number of conditions which can lead to arteriopathies, and genetic arteriopathies have a place in that in the middle. But apart from the arteriopathies, you can have a number of prothrombotic disorders. Again, these could be genetic in origin. You could have sickle cell disease as a cause of stroke. You could have various metabolic disorders, again, which are genetic in nature and could be a cause of stroke, and a number of connective tissue disorders. So there's Ehlers-Danlos, again, the vascular type, Marfan syndrome, and a number of others that could lead to stroke and are genetic in origin. So as you can see, it's practically impossible to talk about all these disorders or include everything in this single talk. So I'm going to choose some of the more important topics, some of the more fascinating topics that I've been following in the last few years as well. So if you look at primary arteriopathies and genetic arteriopathies, you've got Moyamoya syndrome. There is an interesting story about RNF213 now. There is a particular gene, GUCYIA3, that gives a combination of achalasia cardia and Moyamoya syndrome. There's ECTA2, there's COL4A1 and COL4A2. There are syndromes with arteriopathy. There's ATP7A, so there's Menkes kinky hair disease. And there is the whole genetic setup of Aicardi-Gouttier syndrome, and especially SAMHD1 amongst that. So I'm going to talk about Moyamoya syndrome. I'm going to talk about ECTA2. I'm going to talk about COL4A1 and A2, and I'm going to talk about SAMHD1. Before going to these monogenic disorders, I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 more talked about polymorphisms. So just to clarify, polymorphisms are basically genetic variations. They could be a single nucleotide change, or they could be a change in the whole, in a large portion of the gene. But basically, they are there in more than 1% of the population. So more than 1 in 100 would carry these polymorphisms. And they might increase the risk of a person having a stroke. But in spite of being studied extensively, there are some which are conclusively contributive, and there are some which the jury is still out for. So I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 common polymorphisms. The first one is prothrombin G20-210A. So it's a guanine to adenine single nucleotide polymorphism in the prothrombin gene. It's found in about 2% Europeans. That makes it a polymorphism, but it's exceedingly rare in Asians and Africans. So if you've inherited the prothrombin polymorphism, then it will increase prothrombin levels and hypercoagulability, which leads to a 2 to 4-fold increased risk of venous thrombosis. But also recent studies and meta-analysis have shown that it has a moderate to strong association with young onset ischemic stroke. So this makes it an important polymorphism in pediatric onset stroke. The 2 MTHFR genes, so the A1298C, so A2C mutation of the 1298 nucleotide, it leads to basically a reduction in enzymatic activity and an increased plasma homocysteine. So when we looked at a meta-analysis of 13 studies, there was an increased risk of ischemic stroke. However, when you looked more carefully into this study, it was not shown in a sub-analysis for European population, but it remained true for the Asian subgroup. So still for our Asian subgroup, the MTHFR gene A1298C is a possible contributory factor to ischemic stroke. When we talk about the C2T 677 MTHFR mutation, basically this point mutation leads to a 50% decreased enzyme activity at 35 degrees and 65% lower activity at 46 degrees. So basically homocysteine levels are raised at homozygous levels and mildly raised in heterozygous individuals. So it can lead to an increased risk of both ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke in children in both Caucasians and Asians. So again, an example of an overlap between ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke. Okay, so I'm going to then now talk about the monogenic disorders that I've selected today. So there's Moyamoya disease first. Moyamoya disease has long been felt to have a genetic origin. It seems that we are still dealing with the tip of the iceberg when we talk about pediatric moyamoya, because recently it has been found that there is a ring finger protein RNF213 mutation. Basically, it's a polymorphism at R4810, which leads from an arginine to lysine substitution. And it seems to be the strongest susceptibility factor for MMD in East Asian populations. Now, what is interesting is that not all the patients with MMD have this genetic variant. So it is likely that it is a strong susceptibility factor, but there are other genes and environmental factors at play. When looked in the Japanese population, 95% of patients with familial MMD carried this polymorphism. So quite a high correlation. 80% with sporadic MMD also carried this, and it was only found in 1.8% of control individuals. So clearly, there was a much higher risk of MMD in patients who carried this mutation. Again, it's interesting that if you carried a homozygous mutation, it predicted an earlier onset and a more severe form of disease in childhood. It causes classical MMD when it's present in a heterozygous state. But when the same variant is present in the homozygous state, as we will see from a case report, systemic vascular diseases can be present. So again, this represents a new model of MMD where multiple vascular beds could be involved. So if you have somebody who has inherited this mutation, you will know that you need to look for a multiple vascular bed involvement and not just moyamoya disease involving the cerebral vasculature. So again, with moyamoya disease, there's ring finger protein 213, but of course there are a number of patients who don't have the mutation. In the center, there's the tip of the iceberg, which is the traditionally defined pediatric moyamoya disease, the early presentation one. But of course, there are now many more case reports and publications about adult onset MMD. And also what has interestingly been found is there are a number of patients who have RNF213 who also have intracranial atherosclerosis. Again, there's an interplay between MMD with RNF213 and autoimmune disease or inflammation. One classical example is autoimmune thyroid disease. So patients who have autoimmune thyroid disease could also have MMD. And so again, this exemplifies where genetics and environment meets, and there could be an explanation why some people develop moyamoya disease and some children don't. Now, we were just talking about multiple vascular beds, and this is a clinical report, a recent report that has come out in American Journal of Medical Genetics. And in these particular patients, RNF213 mutations were found. They were de novo missense mutations at the C-terminal, so not the same polymorphism that we just talked about. And interestingly, as shown in these images, the patients developed skin lesions, typically with central clearing. They had central white matter changes and classical changes of moyamoya disease on angiography. So basically watch this space and keep thinking about patients with moyamoya disease as it might change how you approach these patients. So if you've got a more than 3-generation family history and basically look out for systemic vascular involvement such as peripheral pulmonary stenosis and renal artery stenosis, then you might be dealing with a case of familial MMD. Genetic testing should be considered in East Asian patients with MMD and a family history of moyamoya on both paternal and maternal sides who are potentially homozygous for this polymorphism. Genetic testing might be considered in patients with systemic vasculopathy who have a family history as well. And what it means is that this might change the way we treat moyamoya disease, because at the moment, surgical treatment still remains the mainstay, but it might open up a whole range of pathways and treatments, medical treatments that so far have been poor, so far patients have shown a poor response to. So things like retinoid, things like medications that increase caveolin. Again, the antiplatelet agents, aspirin, it comes back into play as it is anti-inflammatory. and these pathways are now considered inflammatory again. Things like cilostazol, which is both an antiplatelet agent and a vasodilator for the cerebral vasculature, might be an interesting option as well. Okay, so moving on from Moyamoya disease, basically I'm going to talk a little bit about sickle cell disease. The reason why I've chosen sickle cell disease is because it's one of those conditions which predisposes to stroke. And also currently available data indicate that 50% of the patients assessed sickle cell neonates are born in only 3 countries, that is Nigeria, India, and DR Congo. So India has a huge patient load. I don't see many patients with sickle cell disease in Ahmedabad, but we'll look at the distribution of cases in India. And of course, the number of cases are much higher in tribal areas or where you have patients from tribal areas. If you have sickle cell disease, there's a 200-fold increased risk of stroke and 400-fold increased risk of cerebral infarction. So that's a remarkable increase in risk. And so one of the strongest genetic factors that can determine stroke. 11% of the clinically apparent stroke occurs by age 20 years. Hemorrhages tend to occur more in the 3rd decade, ischemic stroke earlier on. 2/3 of patients who have infarction tend to have a recurrence in 2 to 3 years. So that's a very high rate of recurrence as well. Now, looking at this map of India and where the distribution of sickle cell disease is, I can see that the north of India almost seems free of cases of sickle cell disease. In the south of India, it's purely seen in tribal populations. The percentages are written in the brackets. And the middle band, so that's Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, moving on to Chhattisgarh and West Bengal, and Orissa. Basically, you can see it in different populations. So north of India, not much of it is seen. South of India, it's purely tribal areas. But in the Midlands, Heartland, you need to look out for it in different populations. And what is the pathogenesis of sickle cell disease and stroke? So the sickle cells itself, they lead to vascular injury. They lead to a inflammatory response, and basically there's a cascade. So the sickle cells then start getting involved in formation of a thrombus. A lot of fibrin is involved here in the intravascular lumen, and you tend to develop occlusive disease, which will lead to ischemic stroke. So what is the treatment of cerebrovascular stroke along with sickle cell disease? So one of the studies has now very well defined that cerebral arterial blood flow velocity, defined as flow of greater than 200, is associated with a clear increased risk of stroke. So Dopplers are the mainstay of defining those patients who have sickle cell disease and are at risk of stroke. If they are at risk of stroke, transfusion therapy, and that basically resulting in hemoglobin S remaining at 30% or below, needs to be maintained for a long time. Hydroxyurea has been explored as an alternative therapy. There are potential new exciting therapies coming along. Stem cell transplantation is one of them being studied. If you've got a patient who's got sickle cell disease and develops Moyamoya syndrome, so that's Moyamoya disease secondary to sickle cell disease, then indirect cerebral revascularization therapy is the recommended course of action. Okay, so moving on from Moyamoya and sickle cell disease, mention about ECTA2 mutations. So ECTA2 mutations are from a group of 6 different genes that encode actin. Basically, it was found that a single point mutation at the 179 nucleotide that leads to a change from arginine to His basically led to a prototypical example of non-atherosclerotic cerebral arteriopathy. ECTA2 mutation patients, they have distinctive clinical and angiographic features, which we'll discuss or have a look at. Specifically, they have a combination of ectasia and stenosis. So they have dilatation and stenosis at the same time. The blood vessels tend to have a very straight arterial course. They have a what we call a broomstick appearance. There is total absence of collateral, so that is how you differentiate from Moyamoya disease. And there is much more widespread cerebrovascular involvement, so not just the cerebral vasculature, but also the neck vessels and even the vessels leading to the heart. What is interesting is as well that now studies have identified that there are a host of neuroradiological features that can help you in identifying ECTA2 mutation patients. So in the first diagram here, we've got a slightly dysmorphic looking corpus callosum here at the front. There's also involvement of the fornix and also absence of the cingulate gyrus here. Basically, you get a V-shaped corpus, V-shaped ventricular orientation, and that is again due to the abnormality of the corpus callosum. Here, you can see the typical MRNGO features, so broomstick-like straight arteries, occlusion, and no basal collaterals. The pons in the MRI brain looks like it has two humps here, and that is one of the, again, classical features of ECTA2. The midbrain, it looks like it has been squeezed from the sides, so a squeezed midbrain. And when you look at the pons in the sagittal view, you see a series of bumps here that are basically formed by the dilated blood vessels that pass through this area. So the neuroimaging findings of ECTA2, apart from the classical angiographic findings, so there's bending, excessive curvature inferiorly and anteriorly of the corpus callosum, anterior corpus callosum. There's abnormal radial gyration of the frontal lobes and a deficient anterior cingulate gyrus. There's twin peaks pons, and this is appreciable in all the patients in the parasagittal slice. There's apparent squeezing of the cerebral peduncles in the midbrain. And there's a variable degree of horizontal orientation and thickening of the fornix. And these are the classical imaging findings of ECTA2. Now, this is a patient that we saw at RICN. And as you see the MRI features here, as I was just saying, it's not just the cerebral vasculature, but the hugely dilated vasculature right down here to the arteries. One of the classical signs that we found in this patient, this is not the image of the eye of this patient, but basically a representative image, is dilated pupils. So non-responding mid-size or larger size dilated pupils due to the involvement of the smooth muscle of the eyes is one of the diagnostic features. And this is a patient I shared with Dr. Sanjeev Mehta and basically presented with a acute onset stroke. We did the neuroimaging and we identified the clinical features. When we sent off the genetics, we found an ECTA2 mutation. This is not the same mutation that was found previously in all patients. But of course, this is still described along with aortic aneurysm and familial thoracic 6 disorders. And so we feel this is a new mutation in a patient with ECTA2. Now I move on to one of the conditions I've been tracking for a while. This is the collagen 4A1 disorders. So the first description of collagen 4A1 disorders was found in 2005 by Gould et al. And what he found is interestingly in mice, there was perinatal cerebral hemorrhage. The cerebral hemorrhage ultimately gave way to porencephalic transformation. So these were mice that had cerebral hemorrhage due to a mutation in collagen 4A1, an autosomal dominant mutation, so a heterozygous mutation, which eventually led to porencephaly. Along with these mice in this paper, they described two families that were previously described as hereditary porencephaly and were ultimately found to have a collagen 4A1 mutation. So collagen 4A1 and 4A2 are part of 6 collagen 4As. Collagen 4A1 and 2 are partners in crime. So together in a proportion of 2:1, they form a heterotrimer. So basically they intertwine in between with each other. And what is interesting is that they are part of the vascular basement membrane in a number of different vascular beds. So we first published a paper, a case study of a family with grandmother, mother, and the index child, all three affected with collagen 4A1. This was back in 2009. And these were the days when we used to do single gene testing. So it was not through NGS testing or mass testing. So in these patients, this is the index case. He presented to us with recurrent hemorrhagic stroke in the small vessel disease distribution, distribution, as you can see. He also has signs of white matter change here. And also interestingly, he had congenital cataracts which were operated. These are the imaging findings of the mother. Basically, she also has very identical white matter change. She has a number of areas where there is hemorrhagic stroke, but which she was completely unaware of. So these are silent strokes happening in the area of the basal ganglia, the lacunar area. Interestingly, the grandmother, we picked out her scans as well, and she had congenital cataracts, and she also had the same kind of white matter change, and she had a number of strokes throughout her life course. Following this, in England, we again collaborated and identified a number of families with collagen 4A1 mutations. As you can see, they can present in childhood with epilepsy, including infantile spasms. They can present with cerebral palsy-like phenotypes, so spastic quadriplegia and microcephaly. They often have eye features, which is a clue, so congenital cataracts, nystagmus, or retinal changes. They often seem to have renal findings as well. And there's a range of mutations that can be found in these patients. We were able to publish a case report recently, again, a cerebral palsy mimic. So this was a child, a 15-year-old, who seemed to have a static course throughout her life. She had hemiplegia, she had congenital cataracts, and she had epilepsy. And as you can see in the MRI findings, very subtle white matter change here, porencephaly and ventricular change, which would lead you to think of birth trauma or birth injury, and would lead you to make a diagnosis of cerebral palsy. But the congenital cataracts can often give you a clue. And if you test these children, they might have a collagen 4A1 mutation. What is interesting as well is that, you can have a range of different MRI findings. So there's porencephaly, hydranencephaly, schizencephaly, and this has been reported due to collagen 4A1 mutations. So fetal hemorrhage, then leading to hydranencephaly and schizencephaly. So when you actually see the patient when they're an infant or a child, they might have MRI features that of more severe damage. Not surprisingly, along with collagen 4A1, collagen 4A2 has also been described to lead to similar findings. We are in the process of putting together a series of collagen 4A1 and A2 patients from India. We have a interesting case series of 7 to 8 patients, which we are in the process of writing up at the moment. What is interesting is when we understand these mechanisms, that similar looking conditions, collagen 4A1, CADASIL, and CARASIL, will have entirely different pathways that lead to these changes. So in collagen 4A1, it's weak extracellular matrix here because of the poor formation of the basement membrane that leads to the changes. In CADASIL, due to Notch3 mutation, there is an accumulation of osmophilic material around the basement membrane. And in CARASIL, it is the switching off or the abnormal regulation of TGF-beta pathway due to the HTRA1 mutation. So 3 conditions, entirely different pathways, but that might help you decide on treatments. And so when we talk about treatments, recently sodium 4-phenylbutyrate has been tried in mice in reducing intracerebral hemorrhage and myopathy in collagen 4A1 patients. And so this is a space to look out for and has potential for patients with these disorders. So I come to the last part of my talk. I'm going to talk about SAMHD1 mutations. So this is an interesting paper about Aicardi-Gouttière syndrome from Yannick Crow, who has described these disorders in quite detail and has a number of publications. He has put together all the 7 mutations leading to 5 different phenotypes in Aicardi-Gouttière syndrome. The non-syndromic spastic paraparesis, I have a few patients with RNase H2B, and they can look like cerebral palsy again. But the most important one for genetic stroke is SAMHD1, and it leads to cerebral vascular changes. So there are reports of SAMHD1 mutation. These are patients who have calcification, as in Aicardi-Gouttier syndrome, and they have on MRI, MR-angio occlusion findings of changes in the circle of Willis. So what would you see as a hallmark in patients with SAMHD1? Basically, you see a common theme of multifocal stenosis and aneurysms in large arteries. You see chronic ischemic changes, moya-moya morphology, and you see evidence of prior acute infarction and hemorrhage. You might be able to see other features that are suggestive of Aicardi-Gouttier syndrome, so IUGR, failure to thrive, and short stature. The skin features that we talk about in Aicardi-Gouttier syndrome, so the chilblain lesions, glaucoma, migraine, arthritis. There could be blood investigations that can lead you to the suggestion that this is Aicardi-Gouttier syndrome. Basically, as we know, Aicardi-Gouttier syndrome are a group of interferonopathies. Basically, you see an autoimmune type of phenotype when you investigate these children. What is interesting is that this has led people to try out treatments. And in this particular case report, tocilizumab, which we talked about a lot when we were dealing with COVID cases, it was out of supply. Tocilizumab was used quite a lot to switch off the inflammatory process. The same treatment has been used in a patient with SAMHD1. Of course, I have to acknowledge that the same patient received a lot of immunotherapy, but it seems like you could actually reverse the MRI findings in this patient due to a genetic stroke. So I would like to conclude my talk here. The key messages are there are huge advances in recognizing genetic mutations that can lead to changes in the vasculature and hence lead to stroke. Some of these will lead to multi-system involvement. Also, patients within the same family or the same individuals will have different features which you need to look out for. And what is most exciting is that there have been advances in the understanding of mechanisms which could lead to development of newer treatments and could entirely change the way that we approach these conditions and the management of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Siddharth, for that comprehensive talk on pediatric stroke, where you touched upon the links of genetics with the etiology of different causes of stroke, including arteriopathies, moya-moya disease, sickle cell disease, Aicardi-Goutier's, and also touched on different of these conditions. So with that, we move on, and at this point, I would like to request Mr. Prasanna of ORDI to say some words.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, all the doctors. As a part of our ORDI mission to engage stakeholders in our journey, CME and webinars are one of our major programs. It is really a great experience and satisfying with this webinar series. We started SIMG last year with 13 sessions, and this AOCN series with 15 sessions, 45 speakers, and 30 moderators. It really a successful program, both in terms of attendance and quality of topics and speakers chosen. In terms of numbers, we had average 200 attendance per session and 502 unique doctors who attended one or the other session in the last 15 sessions. If the program is good, it is usual to get a positive feedback from the attendees, but we have been receiving the positive feedback by the doctors who have missed and not attended the program. That speaks a lot about this program. And also we have been getting a lot of requests for recorded session, which really great, satisfying to hear from the doctors about the success of this. Any success depends on the teamwork, and I take the opportunity to thank all the speakers and moderators who are main pillars for this success. I am thankful to the doctors who attended this session, sparing their weekend, and look forward to their support in future also. I also thank Dr. Aneta Hegde, President AOCN, for giving this opportunity to us and also supporting, encouraging wholeheartedly from the day one. Dr. Ann, who has spent a day and night in finalizing the speakers and topics for months together, is the main person behind the success of the quality in terms of quality, and we are grateful to her. I cannot forget our sponsors, Mr. Satyanarayana, CEO of BryoBliss, and Mr. Shaiket from Lifestyle, who supported us. Last but not the least, the backend managed by Dr. Ramya, Swami, and Shreya, who have managed every minute details to make it successful. I'm hopeful that if AOCN permits, we'll meet again for the next season 2 of this series. Till then, I say goodbye with a request, all of your doctors, for extra support to our rare disease community to bring smiles on patients and families. Thank you so much and good night.
I think that we open the session now for question and answers.
Yes, I think we can go ahead. So Neelu, can you, if you see any of your questions, can you take them one by one?
Yes, I think the first question which I could see was just a minute. Yeah, this was a question asked by Dr. Kshitij Mankad. How do you distinguish, I think it's for Dr. Renu, how do you distinguish early spastic CP from early HSP? Can both be progressive or non-progressive for a period of time?
Thank you, Dr. Mankad, for this question. It's really a difficult question for me to answer. But as I've told you, a clear-cut period of improvement in milestones is observed in children with HSP before onset of spastic regression. And in children with spastic cerebral palsy, they continue to improve, and there is usually no regression in the absence of contractures or deformities. So in all cases of HSP, the diagnosis is usually earliest cases, even in the earliest cases, diagnosis is established around 4 to 5 years of age when there is a family history. But in the absence of family history, the diagnoses are usually delayed. So the mean age of presentation, the mean age of diagnosis is usually 6 to 7 years of age. So, for the answer is that yes, definitely there would be a like children with cerebral palsy have an improving course, and children with HSP have an initial normal development, and then they develop this progressive symptoms of spasticity, and usually they are slowly progressive cases.
Thank you, Dr. Renu. Dr. Arijit, you want to take on the next question?
Yeah, the second question, again to Dr. Renu, is about what are the clinical clues to repeat MRI brain in a child with suspected HSP, as you showed in your first case?
Yeah, my first case was pretty odd. If you see from 7 years to 13 years, she from initial spasticity, ataxia to became non-ambulatory. So that was a very rapid progression. So if you have new onset neurological symptoms, very rapid progression, presence of extra neurological manifestations, then definitely it is an indication. If the first image you've seen is not fitting well, then to repeat an image. So that course is not typical for HSP to become non-ambulatory within 5 years. So typically HSPs are very slowly progressive, and hardly there is any involvement of upper limb and bulbar symptom other than just brisk reflexes. So very rapid progression symptom, extra neurological accumulating neurological signs and symptoms suggest it is a time to repeat the image if the initial images are inconclusive.
Okay. Then there's a question about what is the difference between genetic heterogeneity and genetic pleiotrophy? I think it's a question on genetics. If you can answer that, please go ahead.
Pleiotropy, it actually means a single gene responsible for multiple traits and multiple organ involvement. Typical example is like PKU. So you can have skin, hair, mental retardation from mild to very severe to white matter changes. So that is pleiotropy, single gene, multiple manifestations. Heterogeneity means there are multiple genes involved in the causation of single phenotype, like this is like heterogeneous disorder like HSP. So you have almost 80 genes with almost culminating a single phenotype with progressive spasticity, hyperreflexia, extensus plantars. So that is difference. I think details need to be explained by some geneticists.
Right. If I can now go to Dr. Siddharth and ask a question that I had myself. You sort of detailed a lot of genetics that have come up or are coming up in pediatric stroke. Now, for a pediatric neurologist or even a general pediatrician who doesn't see stroke that often, would you be able to give us a simplified sort of answer as to when you would think about doing genetic tests on such a case who has presented, or would you now think about screening genetics for every child with a pediatric stroke?
Okay.
Dr. Siddharth.
Arijit, thanks for the question. And me, myself, of course, just like you, when we're sitting in clinics, we think about the same thing. I think it's like what Dr. Prasad said is like, you know, the more we know, the less we seem to know. And it's always learning, continuous learning as pediatric neurologists. But I think what has emerged is that there are a number of etiologies that can be responsible for pediatric stroke. If you see a patient who clearly has recurrent stroke, you have investigated and ruled out the common possible etiologies. So say cardiac etiology, or on MR imaging, you haven't found a particular arteriopathy. Then you could think of genetic arteriopathies or genetic etiologies. A family history, as I just mentioned. So if not just limiting it to stroke, but of course thinking of different vascular beds. So does the relative have say eye features, or does the relative have migraine, or does the relative have a kidney problem? And would that fit as a family history, and that would lead you to diagnose a genetic stroke? And lastly, if you have a patient who just does not have stroke, but has other features in himself, so skin features, eye features, renal features, that would probably lead you to investigate for a genetic stroke in these patients. And of course, you know, as we learn more about ECTA or collagen 4A1 or SAMHD1, we will start recognizing the MRI features, the MR-NGO features that will clearly lead us to thinking about the diagnosis. In terms of genetic testing, it has become a lot more cheaper over years. It's a lot more reliable as well. And especially in India, it can be cost effective as well. So we can skip a few investigations and straight away go for genetic testing if we feel it is necessary in that case. Okay, very nicely answered. Neelu, do you want to ask the next question, please?
I think the next question I'll ask Dr. Prasad. AGS versus, from an anonymous attendee, cardiac gluteus versus PVL, how to differentiate from imaging?
That's what I showed in my case, where I started off with the child when it was only 5 months old. And on clinical imaging, there was nothing but some spasticity and developmental delay. It depends on when you catch them young, or you have to catch them, the snapshot of imaging has to be at the perfect timing. So if we do it too early, then we'll have to wait for things to evolve, or it depends on the healthcare setup where you're working, and you just order all the panel of investigations and then wait and you do the follow-up. In this case, the child was deteriorating intermittently, and then in the end there were exacerbations. So the child got admitted, they did a CSF workup that showed elevated interferons, and that's how they started saying, okay, fine, we have now elevated interferons, so we are dealing with an interferonopathy. Let's get the genetic workup done. So this is how otherwise for me, like as I said, I showed a bunch of images. And if you ask me which one of this is PVL or PVL-like mimic without any history, with a single snapshot, except for a few cases like PCH or SPG, which have these typical findings, the rest I have to either rely on the prior imaging or I'll have to recommend a follow-up imaging. So this is how we deal with it.
So in a nutshell, it's a clinical radiological correlation.
Yes.
Only radiologically you won't be able to distinguish
At
unless you
times,
have
there are some entities which are quite typical, like what Renu and Siddharth showed about COL4 or ACTA2 or
Yeah.
SPG, which are like, again, the SPG, few subtypes like 11 and 15 that have classic, and PCH type 9. So the rest, I think we'll have to just give differentials and work up. Yeah. Because the
Okay.
thing is that one thing I would like to say is that in Saudi Arabia, to think something is like calling normal, yeah, you're doing a big mistake. So we have to keep our eyes open here, because consanguinity is extremely high, and every family has 1 or 2 siblings or a family history of abnormalities. So the way you work up your cases in what healthcare system you are, it depends on that. Here, almost every kid gets a whole exome sequencing. So
So again, Dr. Prasad, Dr. Gauri Pasi is asking, is it possible to have a normal MRI in a clinically symptomatic child with cerebral palsy?
yes, absolutely. So there is a paper on genetics of the mimics of clinical imaging. Let me just pull it up for you people. I think, yeah, I can share that with Dr. Gauri Pasi, where they have there are at least 2 papers. One is from the Middle East, and the other one is, I think, from an American setup with an Australian, where they have highlighted the various clinical scenarios where you can have normal brain MR imaging, and then there is a wide panel based only on the clinical presentation, whether how you work up. So there is a flow chart in that article, but I thought I presented it from my imaging perspective. But yeah, I have her email. I'll definitely send those articles to her. Yeah.
If you could send it to me, I'll send it to her.
Sure, I'll do that.
The other, sorry.
Yeah, carry on, Anne.
Anne, you want to say something?
Sorry, I interrupted you, Dr. Arijit.
Okay.
No, it's okay. Carry on. You wanted to say something?
Because one of the things that we all come across, no, that people label people as cerebral palsy with normal imaging.
Yes.
Yes, all of us see.
Because sometimes the imaging findings take time to manifest. That's another dilemma. So you might be seeing them, and by the time they get an MR imaging, depends on the setup where you're working, the wait period, if it is a child who cannot lie down in an MRI scanner, anesthesia issues, the wait periods are longer. So it all depends on how you arrange. And if you do it too early, you might miss it, and the child is clinically symptomatic. And at times, it goes the other way around, where you miss the initial presentation, and then what you see is a florid manifestation of the disease.
Also, I've seen that subtle findings sometimes, like even globus pallidi hyperintensities, or even basal ganglia thalamic changes, subtle changes in acute HI. They are sometimes not reported. They are missed by radiologists also, and the MRIs are reported normal in these cases. So that's another thing which we do come across sometimes.
Yeah, I think also it depends on the center where you're working, the field strength, and the coils that you are using for a neonatal brain, and your MR parameters that have to be tailored for a pediatric and neonatal brain. They are a little bit different, and they need to be tweaked to get the optimum imaging findings. And a lot of people, what they do is they apply the same parameters for a pediatric or a neonatal brain, and this is where very often these findings are missed. So that's another take on it.
Dr. Siddharth, the next question is it prudent to extensively evaluate neonates with ischemic stroke? What screening tests can be considered necessary, and what clues can help in looking for genetic stroke among neonates with perinatal stroke?
Yes, so it's an interesting question. And as we know, neonatal stroke is one of the most difficult areas, especially because it is complicated by things like amniotic fluid embolism or polycythemia in the child, or it could be just a premature child who's had hypoxia, and that leads to stroke. Of course, in India, we see a lot of patients who present with infantile hemiplegia, and they all seem to have had a left MC infarct without an apparent reason in a lot of patients. So it's going to be difficult to do a genetic test in all of these patients. I'm sure, on the other hand, we are missing some cases which do have a genetic cause. They're probably being missed in the early stages, but I'm sure are caught up later on. AOCN has done extensive work over the last 6 to 8 months. So we've all been part of the group for stroke guidelines. And I think the subgroup headed by Dr. Anahita Hegde and their group has looked at neonatal stroke. And hopefully they'll come up with wonderful guidelines in the next few months. It has really been studied extensively. So we'll have some evidence-based guidelines. But I would say that common things are common. So still, again, think about the common causes, look for a cardiac cause. Probably in early childhood, I would look for genetic causes, i.e. the metabolic disorders that can present with stroke. So they are going to be much more common from our clinical practice. And then, of course, if you have specific clinical features for the other genetic causes, then look for that.
Right. And another question for Siddharth. What would be the role of aspirin in genetic strokes? Would it be lifelong therapy with aspirin?
Okay, so again, not all genetic strokes we would be advising aspirin. So collagen 4A1, for example, aspirin would be actually maybe contraindicated because you've got a disorder where the basement membrane is fragile, and that is leading to your hemorrhagic / ischemic or combination of strokes. Of course, on the other hand, if you've got abnormalities in prothrombotic factors, you've got some of the polymorphism that is contributing to it, then aspirin would be advised. Moyamoya disease, looking at the recent literature, again, aspirin seems to be advised because of the role of microemboli and thrombosis in Moyamoya patients. So it will be case-based, I guess. As we learn more, there might be specific guidelines for specific disorders, or even more specific treatments for each disorder. So let's hope so for that.
Thanks, Dr. Siddharth. Dr. Renu, the next question is for you. How far is Botox intervention useful for children with HSP? Dr. Akbar Muhammad has asked this question. Dr. Renu?
Yeah, because it is a focal spasticity in patients with HSP limited to the lower limbs, predominantly to the ankle, TA and knee, hamstring. So Botox is a usual treatment modality for these patients. All other oral medications are usually generalized effect with lots of sedation as a side effect. So Botox is a usual therapy for these patients.
What about surgeries? Spasticity?
Yeah, if like it is a very slow progressive disease, then surgical correction of contractures can help these patients. But there are not many studies about evidence-based treatment for these patients now based on the etiology, like in HSP, autosomally recessive inherited 5, there is a problem in cholesterol trafficking. So they atorvastatin is started using. So I think we need to go beyond the usual treatment, and it is a disease modifying therapy which will possibly help these patients and subsequently if the mechanisms and pathogenesis is identified.
My only question was, these being progressive disorders, even if you do the surgeries, it's going to worsen again. So would you think it would be useful? How far should we push the patients to do these surgeries, or we should just use more of Botox and medications?
No, early surgeries are definitely no with these patients. They need to be followed up. These patients, they need regular follow-up. Once they're diagnosed their childhood HSP, then these patients need regular follow-ups. So early surgeries are definitely not like indicated. You need to follow. If they are really slow progressing, then only there may be useful. Otherwise, if it is a slow, rapidly progressing disease, then usually it is not recommended.
Got your point. Thank you. Dr. Kshitij Mankad had also asked another question to you, Dr. Renu. Can we see NBIA-like patterns in HSP?
Yeah, this will be a complex phenotype, complex HSP phenotype with lots of spasticity, ataxia, optic atrophy. So, I'll say complex HSP is a more kind of like it's a disease which has lots of differential diagnosis. So NBIA, atlantoaxial dislocation, leukodystrophies, this all comes as a differential diagnosis of these. Copper deficiency syndromes can come with the myelopathy. So complex HSP is a condition where you need to think before labeling, and till you get a genetic diagnosis, these patients need workup.
Thank you. Dr. Arijit, any other questions?
There's one question that I see as, does col 4A2 cause subdural hematomas? I guess this will be for Siddharth. Does col 4A2 cause subdural hematomas?
I'm not aware of that. So the case series that have been presented or described, col4A2 tends to be milder than col4A1, because if we remember in the chain, it's 2 of col4A1 and 1 of col4A2. So it's going to have a milder phenotype. So they usually present as col4A1, but with a milder phenotype. In the case series that we're writing up from India, again, there were no patients that had subdural hemorrhages. They all presented with ischemic stroke or a mild white matter progressive change kind of disorder. So nothing that I'm aware of.
Right. Another question now for Dr. Prasad. It says from anonymous attendee, how to approach cases of focal neurological deficits seem to be stroke, but MRI does not show diffusion restriction and has normal MRA. Dr. Prasad?
Yes. Quite challenging question actually. How to approach a case with focal neurological deficits and has normal diffusion restriction. Well, again, the differential diagnosis is very wide. And if there are focal neurological deficits, is it like a persistent deficit or there are intermittent deficits? It depends. So are you dealing with an inflammatory brain disease or vasculitis, which could be genetic, or I would say this is more for the neurologist to come and discuss with us and ask what to do with this case. So for me, I would say honestly, as I said, I didn't know, or I would say I don't know honestly. So, but this is how I would approach this case. If it is an acute presentation, then we know what can be done. It may not have diffusion restriction, but it could be some inflammatory demyelinating disorder presenting with focal abnormality, or it could be a genetic vasculopathy, as Siddharth said, or a neurodegenerative process, which could be just the starting point and can later progress. So it all depends on when you see it. And if the patient is on the scanner at the right time, we can definitely give a lead point for them to investigate. This is how I would say.
Thank you. Nilu, any last questions?
Yeah, I think Dr. Renu, two anonymous attendees have asked, do we have any clinical trials in India or abroad for HSP in terms of gene therapy or any other trials for treatment?
No, right now it is not in India. Only one study regarding HSP CYP2A mutation associated. Only in one study is doing a study with the atorvastatin, as I know. Rest, right now there is no study being conducted. Trials are conducted in India. Regarding this question to Dr. Prasanna, I would say if like image is absolutely normal, think of a channelopathy. ATP1A mutation, alternating hemiplegia, or if image is showing some changes, then think of other pathologies, inflammatory, small vessel vasculitis, and all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think we have covered all the questions that were put in the chat box. I would like to thank all the doctors who have given the questions and the speakers who answered all of them very nicely. We are coming to the end of the last session. On a personal note, I would like to thank Anne for her tremendous work, for ORDI and AOCN to hold this brilliant seminar series. And Neelu would like to comment, I'm sure, and after that we can hand you back to Anne.
Yeah.
Neelu?
Yes, thank you, AOCN team and Dr. Anahita for a very, very enlightening series. And I could attend, fortunately, most of them. And hope we continue to have such series maybe every year or something. And I think all of us have gained a lot. And today's session was wonderful. All the three speakers, your inputs, your expertise, it was excellent. Learned a lot of new things and hope to use it in our practice. And thank you very much.
So I'll just say the final thank you. I must say that it has been a great opportunity. Thank you to all the speakers. Dr. Prasad, thank you, sir, for accepting it. And all of you were fantastic. It's sort of, even though there was some amount of overlap, it actually, because the topic, the concept is a little bit difficult, it was good. So it was really good. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Neelu and Dr. Arijit, for doing it so gracefully. But I want to say a thank you to all our delegates. Most of the people who've been attending most of our regular delegates, like for example, Dr. Meenakshi Bhatt is a very, very senior. Today is the only day she's not there, but she's attended like 14 out of 15. She's very, very senior. She's one of the senior most geneticists in the country. So we've got people like that from NIMANS, from AIIMS, from all that kind of people attending throughout. And it's been great seeing their confidence and seeing that they're attending. So thank you to all of them, and that they're still wanting to learn. And that should, and I must say personally, I learned a lot. But on a personal note, thank you to ORDI. Most importantly, I've enjoyed working with ORDI. I've been an ORDI doctor for the last, I think, 6 years. No, not 6 years. Formally for the last 2 years. So if you have any patients and stuff, ORDI can't self-advertise. Since I'm not formally, meaning I've not signed anything with them, I can advertise for them and say, it's great working with them. So if any patients are there, ask them to register. Shamelessly advertising for them.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you so much for your support. Again, thanks to everyone for your wonderful support and participation in this series. In fact, Dr. I.C. Verma was there today, the attendee.
So Dr. Madhulika Kapra was also in between there.
Yeah,
and
they were regularly, in fact. Only today's session they were not there, but the most sessions they attended.
So the beautiful thing about this was it was very interdisciplinary. Like today, neuroradiologists and neurologists and geneticists and psychologists and different kind of people. But I must say, Dr. Anahita really helped. This chalking out the program took 6 months. Mr. Prasanna knows, we dragged our feet to get it right. And Dr. Anahita was really instrumental in trying to shape it up. We did chase people, but thank you to all the speakers, the moderators, and to all of you. And we will have all of this ready on the website. No, Mr. Prasanna, Monday?
Yes, we will have it.
A lot of queries regarding whether these will be available.
Yes. It will be live tomorrow. Also, we'll start uploading from tomorrow onwards, 1st August. I mean, day after tomorrow.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, ORDI. Yes. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good night.
Good night.